So while John is coming up, I first talked to John when I had taken some people down to register in Union County and got arrested, and Chuck and them had told me that I should call the Justice Department collect and ask for John Doar. So I did, and I lucked out. Yeah.
Well, I think I should give you a little background. I grew up in western Wisconsin. My father, my brother, my cousin were all lawyers. And I was fortunate enough to have a mother who was a school teacher, and she required her sons to work hard. And as a result of that, I was admitted and went to Princeton. While I was there, I started in Princeton in 1940. And my college career was interrupted with the war. But both before I went off to service and when I returned to get my last year in, I can remember some conversations I had with my classmates. I remind you that at that time, Princeton was an all-male school, and it was all white. But however, it was heavily populated with Southern boys. And they were, in a good sense really, but they were really competitive about Yankees and the Confederates. And so from time to time, we would talk about the situation in the South, and what about this segregation? And I can remember my college classmates from the South saying to me, yes, we acknowledge we've got a problem, but the worst thing that can happen is that the Yankees come down to try and fix it. This was in 1944. I went out to war, started in the field artillery, transferred to the Air Force, and in my Air Force training to become a pilot, I trained in West Helena, Arkansas, which is right across this river from Clarksville. I trained in Greenwood. I trained in Lake Providence, Florida, the Panhandle, and I trained in Greenville, South Carolina. So, in a sense, even though the Air Force was pretty well confined to the training fields, again was exposed more to segregation. After graduating from Princeton, I went to the University of California Law School, and I was determined to make my fortune in California. Some circumstances didn't work out that way, and I went back to practice law with my father and brother in this little town in Wisconsin, and I was there from 1950 to 1960. And it happened that in early 1960, I happened to be trying a case out in California on behalf of a friend of mine when I got a call from a lawyer in the Justice Department who was a class ahead of me, and he offered me the job of being his first assistant in the Civil Rights Division. And looking around, it seemed to me, I recall our discussions 15 years before at Princeton, that really, although yes, the Brown decision had been decided in 1954, but it didn't seem to me, from what I could read in papers, that very much had changed overall following the Brown decision. And I decided that I would accept the job as the first assistant in the Civil Rights Division. Now, there was another factor that influenced me, and that was that In the South at that time, the South was a one-party system, and senators and congressmen from the southern states had a lot more power than senators and congressmen from Wisconsin, just because we had a competitive system, and so the seniority was much harder to build up by a single congressman or senator than it was in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, Texas. And so we moved, my family and I moved to Washington on the 4th of July, 1960. And I was told when I went into the Justice Department that my responsibility was to supervise the enforcement of the 1957 and 1960 Civil Rights Act that related to discrimination and intimidation in voting. And I found that at that time, although the Civil Rights Division had approximately 30 to 35 lawyers, that there was probably, and I'm not exaggerating, not over 6 or 7 lawyers that were working on voting. And one Saturday in August of 1960, I went down to the Justice Department and found 2 young lawyers working on a case in Haywood County, Tennessee. And I offered to help them go through FBI reports to see if we could build a case of intimidation by the power structure in Haywood County against black sharecroppers who just had tried to go up and register to vote. And after going through the documents, my practice in Wisconsin was that I would investigate my cases myself. I didn't have the FBI to work for me. And so I said to the man I worked for, I believe I go down to Haywood County, Tennessee and look around for myself. And I say this accurately and truthfully, I believe I was the first lawyer in the Civil Rights Division or in the Justice Department that wanted down south and look around for himself to see just what was happening. And of course, by the end of the year 1960, I had been exposed to the situation in Haywood County. We had tried a case in Memphis in the week before Christmas. As soon as that case was finished, another lawyer and I went down to East Carroll Parish in Louisiana to interview a black farmer there who was not able to get his cotton gin just because he'd gone to New Orleans to testify about his experiences in trying to register to vote. And we brought a case there, and that's where things stood when Robert Kennedy came into the Justice Department. He came to my office either the first or second day after he was there and asked me to tell him what was going on. And he said to me that the black people in the country had been very good to his brother in the 1960 election, and he wanted to show the black people that the government appreciated that and he wanted to do something effective. And he suggested that perhaps we should intervene in a school case in New Orleans. I told him I didn't think that was the best case to intervene in, and he said, well, is there anybody smarter than you are down in the Justice Department? And I said, there are a lot of people smarter than I am, but still it wouldn't be a good idea. And so that was my relationship with Robert Kennedy in the first days of his administration. And I told him we had this problem with the sharecropper in East Carroll Parish, and the problem was he couldn't get his cotton gin. And he set out to work through his political connections to get those people to agree that they would talk to the ginners in East Carroll Parish and the ginnies help us to get his cotton gin. And he then sent me down to Monroe, Louisiana, to see that the dinners would tell the district judge down there that they, yes, they would gin his cotton. That's the way it started with respect to the enforcement of the 1957 and 60 Civil Rights Act. I can tell you that I don't think that the civil rights organizations had any faith that anything good was going to come out of that. But nonetheless, that was all we had. And shortly thereafter, he appointed a wonderful lawyer named Bert Marshall to be head of the Civil Rights Division. And from that time until Robert Kennedy left the Justice Department, I worked for Bert Marshall and Robert Kennedy. And one day in late February 1961, Bert Marshall said to me, come up, the Attorney General wants to know what the strategy is to enforce the laws with respect to voter discrimination. And you come up there and tell them what your plans are. Now, I'm speaking principally to the college students who are here, because I'm not so sure that they have had much education with respect to just exactly what kind of a system the country operates under. But it's a federal system, and that means that there's authority in the federal government, and that there's three branches of the federal government that have separate powers, independent powers, and then there's the powers of the 50 individual states. And the thing that historically has held this country together, the glue that has held this country together, was the federal court system. And the federal court system and the federal system is that there are federal district courts that operate alongside of the state court system in all of the states, all of the 50 states. Some states have two judicial districts, some states have three, but at least there's 2 to 3 federal judicial districts in each of the states. And if you look at Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama, you find that there was 3 in Alabama, 2 in Mississippi, and 3 in Louisiana. So that meant there were 8 judicial districts. And our strategy was we were going to bring cases as fast as we could in each one of those districts. And to which Robert Kennedy said that was too slow. He wanted cases in every parish or every county in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. He wanted it done the day before yesterday. Marshall said to him, well, General, if that's what you want, we have to have more lawyers. And Kennedy said to Marshall, how many do you want? Marshall said 4. 4 lawyers. I'll tell you right now, in the Civil Rights Division, 550 lawyers. And so we went for our 6 and 8 to 10 to 12 lawyers. And that's how we started. But the lawyers that were there at the time, these 5 or 6 lawyers I worked for, were really wonderful men. And they were wonderful lawyers. Now, of those people I'm talking about, 5 of the 6 are no longer with us. And they are casualties of the efforts that the Civil Rights Division put in during the period from 1961 to 1968. And as a result of that, here's the way we worked. We had a rule that lawyers could work in pairs. If there weren't enough lawyers around, there would be a lawyer and a paralegal working together. And they would leave Washington at 5 o'clock on Friday evening. And they were to come back from the south 2 weeks later on Sunday evening. So there were going to be 16 days in the South interviewing black people with respect to their experiences in registering to vote. Because really, nobody knew exactly what was going on in these registration offices in the government. And so these lawyers would fly to Atlanta and then go get on DC-3 and start for Shreveport. Someone would get 2 of them would get off at Montgomery, 2 Meridian, 2 Jackson, 2 Monroe, and 2 Shreveport, sometimes 4. And they would then work that territory and going door to door, literally, and interviewing people about their experiences in trying to register to vote. And at the same time, the 1960 Act gave the Justice Department the power to go in and photograph all the voters' records. And so we were able to get the FBI to do that. When the FBI did it, they would not, they claimed they didn't have the manpower to analyze the records. And so we put lawyers and paralegals, secretaries, examining voter registration records. And as they got experience with it, you could find that there was three keys to what was happening. And what was happening was that the system we found was absolutely corrupt. That if you were white and you breathed, you voted. If you were black and you had a college education and a master's degree, chances were in some of these counties, many of them, you didn't vote. And the way this was done was we had 3 things that these young lawyers would look for, and that would be, was there any, in selecting the constitutional provision to be interpreted by the voter, potential voter, was there any discrimination in the way the registrar selected provisions? We found, of course, that with black people, they got the toughest sections of the constitutions to interpret, and the whites got the easiest one. And then the second thing, we looked to see whether there was any assistance by the registrar, and finally we looked at how the registrar graded the application. And so selection assistance graded, and that was a code, so to speak, that we could put people that were not legally trained to analyze, and we were able to analyze an awful lot of records very quickly. And to then use the FBI to go out and interview people that had not had good experiences in trying to register. At the same time, there was one very good district judge in Montgomery, Alabama, named Frank Johnson. And he was absolutely a terrific man, very courageous, very straight. And he called me very soon after Robert Kennedy became Attorney General. He said, I've got a case down in Tuskegee, Alabama. And I've got a court session in Opelika in 3 weeks. And I want to try that case at that session. And we said we would be ready, and we went down, one or two of these new lawyers and myself went down to Tuskegee and went through the records ourselves, and we saw that we just had a marvelous case. Couldn't be a better case. And that, as I said, what we found was that there was a white person in Tuskegee County, and he could breathe, he voted. Didn't make a difference if he could read or write, it didn't make a difference if he only went through the 3rd grade, didn't make any difference how poorly he interpreted the constitutional provision. Nonetheless, he voted. And so that by March of 1961, what was clear to us in the Civil Rights Commission is that the country, we the United States had been operating under a corrupt, dishonest system of self-government for almost 100 years. Think of it. For 100 years, people that were as entitled to vote as any other citizen in the country were being deprived of that basic right just because of their race or color. And that was the information we had. Bob had said, well, how did you enforce the law? The way we enforce the law is to get before the federal judges who, for the most part, were not friendly residents in the district courts, and present these cases. Black citizens didn't vote, white illiterate did vote, black citizens didn't vote, white illiterate did vote, and just keep doing that for 2 or 3 days. There's maybe 25 black witnesses and 25 white witnesses. And finally, we've got a case that is just inarguable. It's just terrible, terrible dishonesty and corruption. And when the district courts, particularly in Mississippi, when the district courts saw what we were trying to do, they did not adopt a strategy. What do you think the strategy was? The strategy was, well, we won't decide the cases. We'll just say we got to study this further, and so we won't decide it. If you don't decide it, then you can't appeal it. And like Marshall said, let's try to appeal it anyway. And we did take an appeal to the Fifth Circuit judges in the next higher court. And our argument was that under the facts of the cases as being presented to the court, a refusal to rule was the same thing as a denial. And therefore we had a right to appeal the denial. And we took the appeal on the denial, and then we went to the Court of Appeals and said we'd like to get an injunction pending appeal. That means we want an injunction right away. We don't want to wait a year to get it done. We want to get it right away. And the Court of Appeals under Judge Tougaloo, Judge Wisdom, Judge Brown, Judge Reeves, they granted us that relief. And they put the registrar, according to the Court of Appeals, they put the registrar under an injunction. And of course the registrar, speaking now in Hattiesburg, because that's one of the big cases I'm going to speak about in a minute. That registrar in Hattiesburg immediately continued to do just exactly the same thing he's been doing for the last 10 or 12 years, was rejecting blacks. And so we went back to the Court of Appeals and we said, we want to hold the registrar in contempt on the court. And the issue was that, well, who's going to decide whether he was in contempt or not? And of course, the local lawyers for the registrar said, well, it should go back to the district judge and let he should decide it. But we argued that he didn't. The case was before the Court of Appeals, and Judge Tuttle decided we were right, and he assigned 3 judges from the Court of Appeals to go to Hattiesburg to hear a voter registration case that was going to last a week to 10 days. Now, if you look at the history of litigation in this country, there's never been anything like that happened ever before. The Court of Appeals, which is supposed to review the decisions of the district court, is now actually trying the facts to decide for themselves whether there was justice or injustice done. And I was in Hattiesburg with another lawyer presenting that case to Judge Tuttle and Judge Wisdom, not Judge Tuttle, Judge Brown, Judge Wisdom, and Judge Bell. And out of that case, I think it's fair to say Judge Wisdom and Judge Brown were fully educated with respect to the amount and size and the duration of the corruption in Mississippi with respect to voting. And The reason why that is such a significant case is because at the same time, we found that it was too slow to sue registrars in each county one by one. And one of the lawyers I referred to developed the theory that we should sue the state of Louisiana and the state of Mississippi. And then, out of those two cases, there are cases that I would urge all of you college students to read. A case called the United States versus Mississippi and the United States versus Louisiana. And they're just wonderful, wonderful cases that describe exactly what was going on in the states of Mississippi and Louisiana. The beauty of those cases, particularly the Mississippi case, was that the Mississippi lawyers argued, well, if there was corruption, the answer to the corruption is to wipe every voter off the rolls and start all over again. And we could see that if the states had the power to jack the standards up so high that they could effectively keep the majority of black people from voting, because there just was no doubt they hadn't provided the black children in Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama an equal public education to white students. And therefore, our argument was you can't now raise the standards and apply it to everybody. And although the district court didn't agree with us on that, Judge Brown wrote a very vigorous and powerful dissent that was really subsequently adopted in the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Now, I've described for you very quickly, briefly, what was going on within the Justice Department to enforce the law and to help the snake kids, poor, Dr. King, the civil rights movement, get what they were fully and 100% entitled to, the right to vote. And then everything came together in Selma, Alabama in December and January 1964-65. I can tell you that the first case of the Kennedy administration brought in 1961 was in Dallas County, Alabama. I can tell you that it wasn't very much after that. It's the student nonviolent coordinating committee put an office in Dallas County. I can tell you that for the next 3 years, both of those organizations worked independently, but to try to provide all citizens the right to vote. And then in 1964 or early 65, President Johnson had a meeting with Dr. King, and he urged Dr. King to go to Selma, Alabama, or someplace like that, and try to bring the attention of the whole country on the corruption. Dr. King did go to Selma, and then you know what happened at the Selma Ridge in the meetings that the blacks suffered on that ridge that day, and the march to Montgomery. And as a result of that, very quickly came the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And very quickly after that, the case was brought in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court upheld the validity of the Voting Rights Act. So there you had three branches of the government working together to correct the corruption problem and design a system. And that's the way change comes about in this country. You have to get all three branches of the federal government to work together to exercise their respective powers if you're going to bring about changes in serious cultural problems that have gone to the extremism that I described. And so I think what's the lesson for that? The lesson for that is that we've heard from the sick people, they had the imagination and the courage to say, we're going to do something about this. They had the imagination and courage to say, we will work on voting, but we're not going to just work on voting. We're not going to just agree with you as to how you're. We're not going to agree with you as just to how you're going to enforce the law. And I can tell you that the tension between the government and SNCC with respect to protection was very, very serious tension. And we in the Civil Rights Division realized what that tension was, realized how serious it could be, and that made us just work harder and harder and harder to bring about, help bring about this change. And if you look at the history of that area, you have, yes, students, one group, you have corps, another group, you have King's organization, another group, and they are all working independently to bring about a big change. And then you have part of the government, the Justice Department, trying to support that effort in an honest, straightforward, impartial way. And out of that came, as I say, the passage of the Voting Rights Act, which really is the greatest piece of federal legislation that we've ever been passed in this country. I can tell you that the first election after the Voting Rights Act in Dallas County, Alabama, prior thereto, 7,000 citizens voted, and about 6,900 of those 7,000 were white. And no black ever was even had a chance to be a candidate under those circumstances. In the first election after the Voting Rights Act was passed, 17,000 citizens voted. And the candidate that was supported by the black citizens was elected. And today, there's a graduate, black woman from graduate Princeton, now the congressman from Dallas County and the surrounding counties of western Alabama. That doesn't mean that everything is great in this country. It's not. Speaking now with respect to the political culture, it no longer is the case where anyone who wants to vote can vote because of race or color. I'd be glad to answer any questions you have.
Many of us lived through those days, and I personally want to thank you for being a person who was on the right side of human dignity. I worked with you, and I enjoyed your work in Mississippi, and I just want to say thank you. And I'm glad that you're here today to realize the manifestation of much of the work that you and your team did. As we know, Mississippi has the highest number of African-American elected officials in any other state in the country. And much of that is due to your tenacity. And I want to thank you.
How do you feel when you, oh, you go back. How did you feel when you went in some of those small cities and towns, you know, by being, you know, just what?
How
how did you feel, you know, doing your job when you went into those small towns?
Well, I'm a small country town boy. That's why I grew up. Like I grew up in a town of 2,700 people. It was now maybe 8,000 people.
I'm talking about in the South.
I didn't grow up in the South, but I feel I can't tell you how I know about the changes in the entire life of the South. But I can tell you that as this lady spoke about the number of black citizens who are officials, and it's a tremendous change. I'm very proud of that.
You described the lawyers in the Justice Department having a very hands-on role early on, starting in 1960. Give us a sense of what you think would have happened if you didn't have such a hands-on role and the FBI was, you depended on the FBI to bring you the information and to play the role that they had traditionally played.
If the lawyers had not gone out in the field themselves and investigated, we wouldn't have gotten anywhere. Because the FBI didn't like civil rights cases. They talk about, you know, law enforcement cases, burglaries and thefts and various bank robberies, but we had to just urge them along to do the very least that we would expect them to do. But gradually, they began to do their job. And when the boys were murdered in Tougaloo County, the FBI changed. And they did a very commendable job of law enforcement in the Tougaloo County at that time. But if they hadn't changed, the country, I don't think the country could have changed. Because, you know, the FBI had 5,500 agents, and they were supposed to be the investigative branch of the Justice Department. They were supposed to do all of the investigation. And I can tell you, I've had a situation in my own experience there when an FBI supervisor came into my office. I can't remember the year, maybe it was 63 or 64. And he said to me, John, let me see your credentials. And I took out my credentials, pass, and he looked at it, and he said, well, this is not like an FBI credential. I said, no, it's not. And I said, what's your problem? He said, well, there's somebody down in the South, representative, they're representing the FBI or the Justice Department and investigating. And I said to him, well, what's wrong with that? I said, I've been down in the Justice Department for the last 3 years investigating. He said, John, you don't investigate, people just talk to you. And he said, this is what he finally said. He said, Mr. Hoover believes that either he's going to do all the investigating for the Justice Department, or he's not going to do any of it. That was the problem we had to work on. Fortunately, these young people who came to work in the civil rights movement accepted that challenge, and they worked. And they went out in the field. And it wasn't rocket science to talk to somebody and find out what their experience was with voting. It wasn't rocket science to go into a registrar's office and say, let me look at your records. And very quickly pick up if there was cheating in selection, assistance, or grading. And that's what happened. There's another question.
I had good faith
Marshall, who was with you, Ole Miss, from Virginia, and he said that at that time they had some apprehensions about doing their job, but they got together and talked, and they decided that they would do what was right. The right way was to enforce the law. That's right, that's right.
I would tell Mr. Doar, turn around all the time. I would say on the second motion, you all can thank for the work you did. And secondly, let me just say that it sounds like you refer to it as state and the movement. Where I came from, we call it the movement. So there's a little bit of a difference in that. But here's my question. My guess is you've been interviewed time and again by historians and others about the work you did, about your role in this modern civil rights movement. Who would you say has done the best job? And in what book your role in instructing in the movement?
Let me answer that in a way is that I don't think anybody has done a very good job so far with respect to educating our students in high school and college as to how the Voting Rights Act was passed and how hard the SNCC kids worked and how dangerous that work was and how much we are indebted to them for what they've done. Same is true with respect to Cole, and the same is true with respect to Dr. King. Now, I find when I go out and talk to high schools and colleges that everybody in the educational academy pats themselves on the back for what a good job they've done on diversity. And they're very proud of the fact that their college campuses are integrated. But if you ask them, what do you know about SNCC? And what do you know about what went on in Southwest Mississippi? And what do you know about the corruption? They don't know anything about it. And sooner or later, I hope that these fellows behind me will do as good a job of writing their memoirs as they are as telling us about it like they have today. Because we need that. I mean, the white people in this country, the white kids need that. Because it changes their relationship totally with the black kids. Because it was the black kids that did it. And they did it for us. But that story has not been told the way it should be told, in my judgment.
One of the pioneers in helping African Americans secure the right to vote. How do you feel about these conniving and disgusting stealth movement that the Republicans have created in forming these quote-unquote voter ID laws that are sweeping across the country?
Well, I've been asked that a lot. And my answer to that is, I don't know enough about what the facts are to say where the right is and how much one side or the other has got the right on that question of voter identification. But I don't think there's a problem with a simple identification tool, but it's got to be enforced thoroughly. It can't be make a burden on somebody that is unreasonable and unnecessary to vote.
I would, I'd just like to say one thing quickly. That's John was more than just a lawyer to us, just a partner. He was a friend. On top of that is that history of presence in some places like Louisiana and Mississippi also, I think, saved a whole lot of lives.
Yes, it did.
And we appreciate that, John. And I know you did it and met this funeral, because there was set up that for massacre, you saved that, prevented that from happening. I'm glad to be your friend.
Yes.
So, I would like to actually extend I would like to engage John in some of the tensions that happened between the voter registration people on the field and the Justice Department, and there were different theaters of the movement in Mississippi where that took place. But I guess my question is whether you all are up to doing that, or whether we need a break, 5 minutes, and then people who want to come back, do it, or are you ready to just push on through? Push on? How many say push on? Yes. Okay, so anybody who doesn't want to push on, push out. So, Frank, if you want to come up, and Doar, if you want to come up, Dave, Charlie, people who were on the ground doing voter registration, like the Brown decision in 1954, there was a concerted effort in the state of Mississippi to eradicate the NAACP leadership. Right? So there were a number of assassinations that went on before the sit-in movement got started in 1960. But with the movement that we were part of, the bringing of the sit-in movement with the freedom rides into Mississippi, and then the starting of the voting in Mississippi, there were a series of murders that punctuated that movement. The first was Herbert Lee, who was murdered by Eugene Hurst. And John, you remember that you came to Steptoes. I wonder if you would just tell us about that part when you were at Steptoes the Sunday before that.
In September 1961, I was on one of my trips to Mississippi, and they say I met Bob before because he came into my office in Washington to talk about state plans and registering voters. And he had just come back from Southwest Mississippi where he'd been banged around and been identified by the sheriff. He was telling me about what the conditions were in Southwest Mississippi. I said, let's go down there and introduce me to these people that who had worked with. So we got in a car and drove down to, I can't remember whether it was Walthall County or Inlet County, and we went to Mr. Steptoe's house. His house was out in the country. Went off the main blacktop road, took a gravel road up to front door of his house. And it was a nice August or September day. And three of us sat on the front porch of his house. And we talked about what the conditions were in Hammond County, and it was one way to the east of the pole. I asked him who was the most powerful person in his county. He Hurst, white man. He said he's got the next farm of mine. When we were kids, we played together. He's now a state senator in this area. And I asked him if he knew who was in the pickup trucks. Trucks that were driving around outside the board of registration schools and taking out license numbers of the cars. The blacks who had enough courage to come up and talk about board registration with Bob and his colleagues. He said he didn't know that Herbert Lee knew. I said, who's Herbert Lee? He said he's a farmer who lives 5 miles down the road. He said, let's go down to see Mr. Lee. Two of us got in the car, let Mr. Stepstone go down to Mr. Lee's house. And we went up to the farm. Prior to Mr. Lee was there, and they said, no, he wasn't there. It was a Sunday afternoon. They didn't think he'd be back until late. I said, well, I've got to get back to Washington right before night. I've got to get a plane noon for Caribbean. Come back and see this Lee the next time I'm down. So I dropped Bob off on the phone, spent the night in Hattiesburg, caught the plane from Meridian, and I got back to my office at 10 o'clock that night. And I went in my office to see what kind of messages I had, and I had a letterhead memo from the Bureau advising me that, or advising Justice Department. Mr. Hurst had killed Mr. Lee that morning. And they had a college in Liberty College. We were not able to do anything effective with respect to that. And to make it worse, he was a very, very strong and in Lewis Allen, who drove a logging truck. He really wasn't afraid of anything. And he called the coroner's jury right away, as I understand it. He said something to the effect that confirmed that Herbert Lee had a firearm and threatened Mr. Hurst. However, did not confirm that Bob Moses was confirmed to me. That still didn't give us jurisdictional handle to do anything about that. And so the students really couldn't understand that. Couldn't understand why the most powerful country in the world couldn't at least get into court and see what the fact, they could prove what the facts were with respect to that incident. And from that time on, there was tension between the federal government, Justice Department, and to a certain extent the Civil Rights Division with respect to the issue of why can't you protect the border with snake workers and other people that come down in Mississippi to work on border. And the position of the federal government was, we're not a police force, we don't have the authority to do that, and therefore we can only act after something has happened. That is something that the students never could understand. And that created a certain amount of tension between government and students. Now, you just jump forward to 1963, when by that time, student nonviolent coordinating committee had moved out of southwest Mississippi and moved up into the Delta and moved into Greenville. all of the organizers of that marched to the registration office for snake pits, and they were all arrested. And we filed a suit against city officials in Greenwood in the next days. And out of that, the city officials were agreed that they would release these snake pits and that they would not do any more of that kind of arrest in the future. That was not what Bob wanted. I had to deliver him that message. I had to deliver that message to Bob. That wasn't going to bring federal marshals down into Mississippi to walk alongside of groups of blacks that were on the register. And it was really a very painful experience for me. And I think it was painful for Bob. But he wasn't quitting just because of that. And he was changing his efforts, not just to voter registration, but actually getting candidates, black candidates, to run for office. And he was also creating mock elections, or honest elections, actually in Mississippi. And the next thing he came to realize, I think, that the students needed to get some white students down in Mississippi to help them voter registration and bring about this change. Out of that came the Mississippi Summer of '64, when 500 or 600 white college students came in Mississippi to work throughout the state on voting. And I remember being sent out to school in Iowa, where the snake kids had brought these white students together to get a training session. And I remember being asked, well, what kind of protection are we going to get from the federal government while we're down there in Mississippi under these horrible conditions? And I had to tell the students that we were not able to protect them. And I want you to consider that in connection with how you handle yourself while in Mississippi. And I can tell you that message was not well received that day by any means. And as a matter of fact, you know what happened 5 or 6 days later when the 3 boys were back in Neshoba County. They were murdered. And after that, the president sent the head of the CIA down to Mississippi to give him an independent report of the conditions. And he told me, because I went with him, that one of the meetings, Mississippi said that I was to blame for that because I gave the plan a license to kill people. And obviously this was not the fact. That it illustrates the kind of tension there was between the government, the United States government, and the students. It's really unresolved problem. I think subsequently the government conceded that they could have provided some kind of more protection than they did. But they did also say that they didn't believe that would be effective because soon as the federal force was down there,